Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Art of Photography. My name is Ted Forbes, and today in our video I want to talk about a Moroccan-born photographer by the name of Bruno Barbey. And Bruno Barbey is one of those photographers who we've covered a lot of in these photo lit episodes, who I really think has really not been given the credit and due that he has deserved. He's a wonderful photographer and known for the most part for his association with the Magnum group. And if you're not familiar with Magnum, we talked about them a couple weeks ago when we did an episode on Pardon. And Magnum is really the group that set the standard for photojournalism really throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. It is a co-op that is owned by the photographers who run it. And it is not an easy group to get into, and it really represents the best of the best in terms of photojournalism. They make their money through licensing of images, through assignments for actual major publications, and have been for years. A group started by Henri Cartier-Bresson, among other photographers back in the day. And I think that Bruno Barbey represents, for me, one of those photographers who is able to really capture and tell a story, which makes him obviously a very successful photojournalist. But at the same time, and I think you could probably say this for a lot of the Magnum photographers, when you have somebody who travels the world and captures such a rich variety of images, such as Bruno does, it really has a way of telling this story and painting this fantasy that I think is so different, at least in Western culture, from our everyday lives. And I think the best way to go about this is look at some images. And what you're going to note in here is that a lot of Bruno's work I would not consider it to be minimalist in nature. He has a wonderful way of dealing with repetition, with pattern, with dealing with a lot of subjects in one image. And I want to look at that as we go along. Other photographers who fit into this mold are people like Sebastien Salgado, who's a much more well-known photographer and also a Magnum photographer as well. And like I said, Bruno's still alive today. He's had a long career in film and in making images for photojournalistic use. And without further ado, let's take a look at some of the images of Bruno Barbey. Okay, so we're going to look at some images from Bruno Barbey, and just in case you guys are new to the show or you don't know how we typically do this, I use Pinterest for all this. And the reason I use Pinterest is a couple reasons. One, it's really easy to present on the show, and two, it's a great way of bookmarking images. And if you guys are interested and you want to go see what the sources are, where stuff came from, all that good stuff, head over to pinterest.com/Ted Forbes. And the other cool thing about this is you can see kind of what we're working on in advance, since I put the show together obviously before I record it. But anyway, if you go to pinterest.com/Ted Forbes, you'll see all my boards. You scroll all the way to the bottom, and you're going to find a board for Bruno Barbey. It's the newest boards, go to the bottom there. And so we're going to look at some work today. And Bruno, as I mentioned earlier, is extremely talented and amazing photographer, and I think he has so much to offer. I don't know why he's as underrated as he is, but we're going to kind of, I drew out some highlights here, and kind of part of the problem sometimes when I pick people to feature on the show that I really like is, being able to pare down enough images to actually cover in a show, because he's got a lot of stuff. Long career and an amazing eye, an amazing mind, and some wonderful photography in here. One of the things I want to start with is this image, which is one of his more popular images. And this is obviously China in 1980, as the caption says. And you have these cyclists that are cycling towards the square here. And what I find so interesting about what Bruno does from a compositional standpoint, and I think this is really important, is, we've talked briefly in the past about another great Magma photographer, Sebastien Salgado. And what I like about this is these guys, a lot of times there's a lot going on in the image. And we're going to look at a couple images that fit in this theme. And obviously you have a lot of cyclists in the foreground. And this is obviously, not minimalism. In fact, it's almost the opposite, but I wouldn't call it maximalism, because when you have a lot of objects that you're dealing with in a composition, one of the things that makes it cohesive are things like pattern, repetition, and the like. And you see that with the cyclists. You kind of have this almost fray, and this is going to be even more prevalent in some of the images we're going to look at next. But it really creates a nice contrast to the top with the statue. And, you have almost this smog, mist, fog kind of, air coming in, and this beautiful light that's really diffuse coming through that. And what you have here is, with the horizon line right in the middle, a really beautiful contrast. You also have a little bit of pattern echoing with this guy standing on this pedestal here with the statue in the background, and you have the cyclist below. Anyway, amazing image. Continuing on with what I just said, first of all, Saul Leader taught us years ago that you can never go wrong with umbrellas, and what we hear is a sea of umbrellas. Again, it's not minimalism, but it does become minimalist because you have a ton of stuff going on. There are a zillion umbrellas in here. which looks like rain or snow. And, what makes this really so beautiful is just this little pattern of color that kind of starts drifting through the middle of the image. And, people who are great colorists use color as part of the composition. Your composition doesn't necessarily have to depend on color. In fact, I think in about 90% of the cases, your composition should not be dependent on color. But however, there is that 10% where color is used in a way that really makes that image complete. And you just kind of see this subtle pattern coming through the middle here. Again, with the repetition of what we see with objects, with the shape of the umbrella, and you see it quite a bit. Another wonderful shot, and it's another one of my favorites, is this one of these black and white geese. And seemingly you have a lot going on in here. These birds on this sand that stretches out towards the ocean here. But what we're seeing here, you have slight patterns, you have repetition. There's things you can make out amidst what ends up being a lot of objects or subjects in the picture, which is really quite interesting. Another one of my favorites here, and this is a really complex image, but again, this is Throne Day in Morocco, and you have all these people, dressed in the traditional white costume, and just the way the faces peer out. And what's really interesting is you tend to see, and your eye is drawn into what's a little bit off center in the middle photograph with these two gentlemen talking down here. What's also interesting is you see pairs of people talking. There's another one over here. There's a group up here. And so what is, seemingly a complex image ends up being able to breathe and have a little bit of life and cohesivity to it. And speaking of cohesive, this wouldn't work with just a general crowd shot. What makes this work is the fact that they're all in this traditional white dress, which also includes hoods in most cases here. And headwear, and the fact that you just see faces kind of peering out amidst the web of chaos here. That anyway, I just think it's such an amazing thing, and it's such a hard image to get a lot of times, because when you're shooting things where there's a lot going on in the image, it makes it more difficult. Also compared with this shot, which is shoes, and you have this one little red shoe towards the center middle of the photograph, towards the bottom, which is off center. On the third line, more or less, that makes this image complete. And there's a lot of beauty in this. And like I said, there's certainly, I don't think it's derivative of Salgado's work, but you see Salgado is another guy who does a lot of this. Another beautiful image. And I'm not really sure. I wasn't able to find what's going on in this image, but this figure that's walking across, and it looks like fabric or something, these red cloths that lay against the dirt in the background. Again, you have symmetry to a small extent here, but a lot of repetition and a lot of pattern that's happening in the image, which is amazing. And one more to kind of complete this idea here. This is a carnival in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And I mean, this is such a lush image. It is color, although there's not a lot of color going on in the image. The subtleties are what really, I mean, it's a beautiful image if it were shot in a more sharper context, a faster shutter speed. But I think what makes this, going from a great image to an absolutely solid, incredible image is the fact that the little details, the light, it's a little bit dark for a lot of white clothing that's going on in here. But it gives it a mood. It brings it down a notch. I also think the shutter speed is absolutely essentially key to this image. It was shot at a shutter speed that wasn't too fast to absolutely freeze the motion. So you do have a little bit of that motion blur going on. And, with these dancers that are spinning here, there's just an amazing amount of, it's a great dynamic that's going on. There's a lot of energy in this image. And it would not be the same if it were shot at a really fast shutter speed that froze the image more. And anyway, you see that a lot, and this is just so great. And the way the tones, you have these white outfits, but the way that the tones kind of fall off in the localized contrast, and it's just a really pleasing, beautiful light that's going on. Just a great image. Another thing that you see a lot in Bruno's work, I pulled this one too, which I really like, is, the sense of more of a grandiose picture. And, an image like this really gives a nod to maybe 19th century painting in a lot of ways, because you have, this great landscape with people involved in it. These people sitting up watching the ocean, the way the weather's very highly dramatic. The light is absolutely perfect. This was a shot, and I don't know how it was produced. So I can't tell you, but I would imagine that either he was there at the right moment or maybe waited for this, because the way that the clouds come in, it's not too dark, and you have this brilliance of light that you can particularly see echoed in the building over here. Probably a sunset, but the way the sun has to peek through those clouds just right to get that, with the diffuse nature of this approaching storm that's coming in. And as I mentioned, the whole grandiose nature of the whole thing, it really gives a nod to 19th century painting in a lot of ways. And these are really difficult photographs to get. You don't come by them often. They're amazing. Even just the cannons, which are a little bit dark in here, that line the wall. It's just stunning. A really beautiful picture to look at. The other thing that I like about Barbey's work, and we're going to get into this a little bit now, is a little bit of a playfulness that comes along with it. And, what is seemingly, not an extremely difficult shot to get or that impressive, but what's interesting is not so much the composition or what's going on with the subject, but this woman is walking against the yellow sidewalk, and she's against a blue painted wall with these, what look like clouds, and who knows what they are. They could be plaster, it could be paint that's, started to come over the top or chipped off. But, you have a woman walking through clouds essentially. And it's almost this conceptual nature that really becomes humorous to a degree, and I wouldn't say humorous as in funny humorous, but a little bit more playful and a little bit more human and a little bit more enjoyable. You see that echoed here, where you have some elements that I've talked about together coming together, and you have this is shot in Korea, and these two women in the foreground in these wonderful pink hats, which has wonderful color, the way it works. If you split the color out that's coming in this image, the predominant colors I would say are particularly the yellow in the inner tubes, in the water, the pink hats, and probably this kind of greenish hue that you see in the wave and in the sea. There's some other colors that play here, but those are the prominent ones, and the way they work together. And this is one of those shots that works because the color scheme is so interesting. And also you see a great deal of subject matter going in the background with the repetition that you see with the people swimming with these floating tubes in the background. Contrasted horizon line, foreground something much simpler, which are these two women looking on. You don't see their faces, but there is a really wonderful human quality that comes out with this, and it's very unusual to see in a lot of photography, particularly when you don't see the human face, to have it feel human or feel connected at all. And he's doing that with other elements, and it's amazing. Again, a sense of almost humor or playfulness coming with scale, where you see, this human sitting on a giant foot. It just makes a wonderful composition. It's just very beautiful. Again, with the deep blues and this pewter color that comes out with it, that sense of playfulness and how this works compositionally. I mean, if you look at the composition, this guy's sitting pretty much smack dab in the middle of the photograph, but it's still extremely interesting photo because of the fact that he's playing with the scale as such, and it just works, and it's amazing. Another one that I find just really nice is this, it's a cafe, and you have people eating, but the way that these jackets are hung on the outside of this, almost translucent, somewhat opaque material that's over the windows, and the way the light's coming in. And I think most of us can probably agree that successful photographs, most often it's a skill that you develop of working with available light or manufactured light. Sometimes if you're using a flash setup or something like that, but a lot of times light is what creates a lot or a great deal of interest in a photograph, and I think that's obviously prevalent in this work. Another one that I find extremely, again with the humor aspect almost, is this woman against a wall. I assume it's a woman, and you have these geese that are coming up to be fed, and a very playful image, but also somewhat echoed. And you have this illustration back here on the side of this hut that deals with birds and plants and stuff like that. So it's almost like you have this removal of, and I'm going to show you this in an image in a second that, again, is wonderful in this regard, but playing with something that is reality in the face of something that's illustrated or displayed. To give you a better clue of that, we'll look at this image, which I love too. And this is one of those images that when you first look at it, it's like, okay, and then when you look at it a little longer, you realize what's going on here. And I'll talk through a little bit. If you can see what in case the video is not picking it up correctly, you have a pregnant woman that's posing to have her photo pictured, assumably by a photographer who is, out of the picture. And what you have here in the background is a boat and also a photograph in the foreground on a sign of some children peering out a porthole into fish. So, if you think of the pregnant woman and the whole womb aspect of this as being possibly similar to this porthole, and then you have the boat in the background. Anyway, these in the lighthouse, this man standing here, there's a lot of images that tell different stories here. And this is a wonderful example of how all of the figures in the shot play off of one another, either in a conceptual sense where you have the three, you have the woman, and actually there is what looks like the number 3. I don't think it actually is on her dress there. But the pregnant woman, you have the photo of the children looking at the porthole and the boat, and they all work together. They all play off of one another. And then compositionally, you have maybe the pregnant woman again, this gentleman standing behind her, and this line that's created that goes up through the lighthouse in the background. And it's such a rich photo on many levels. And, when you think about photojournalism, and a lot of times, these photographers who capture moments, and, Henri Cartier just saw referred to the decisive moment, or this moment where things all come together. And I think you begin to value, or I do at least, and have a great deal of respect for the fact that the skill to do that and to be paying attention to the degree where those things come together and precisely the right moment where to be, where to stand, and you capture an image like this is very difficult. And it's what makes really most of the photographers in the Magnum school just insanely good, is there's a real respect I have for that kind of work that's being done. Another image that I love too, and that, again, there's layers of complexity that go on here. This is taken in Morocco. And you have a bird's eye view, essentially, of these Islamic patterns in the floor and the tile that come around this fountain. And laced over the top of this, when you consider the patterns, the complexity of it, there's a lot of black and white. It's kind of a checker sense. And, over the top, you have these people in these colored clothes that are coming up to the fountain. So you have a wonderful juxtaposition of, this traditional pattern that's on the floor below with the seemingly somewhat random pattern, but groupings of people over the top that are coming up towards this fountain. And, again, these two layers of repetition and of pattern and of possible symmetry, I think, too, but broken symmetry in a way. You look at even the people grouped around the fountain. Yeah, you kind of have a group of 2, a child here, a group of 3 here. It's really hard to analyze on that level, but I don't think you should. I think it is simply a case where you have a little bit of randomness, but it is held together by the symmetry beneath. And that's really hard to do. And it's really hard to do with public photos and things of the like. Another great one that I love that really says a lot is this gentleman or this boy riding a bicycle that is actually resting in the river here. And I don't know the story that is behind this. And if somebody does, feel free to leave a comment. But it's a really strong image and almost this layer of abstraction that you get of this guy who looks like he's riding a bike in the water, and the water plays with the clarity, plays with the sharpness of the image, and it's strong. I mean, it says a lot. There's a high concept that's going on here. Another one that I love are these women. These are girls watching a fashion show in Istanbul. And again, when you look at what's going on here, there's 5 subjects in the middle. You have the pattern that's going on behind that gives you the symmetry, that gives you that anchor of coherence in the image. But also, the way the women are aligned is just really interesting because the 2 women on each side have very similar poses where they're hunched forward slightly. One is crossing her arms, the other is holding her hands, but the shoulders are hunched forward. The way they're all looking, these 2 women. And then the women in the back kind of give a nice juxtaposition to that. Anyway, beautiful image and just, nice slice of life, but a lot of these same elements we've been talking about. And then I'll end with this image because I think this one is just one of my favorites. Again, there's a nod a little bit to what you would see maybe in maybe early 20th century painting. And it's just a beautiful image. This is another Carnival image. I believe this was Rio de Janeiro, but I'm not sure about that. But you have the main interest, obviously, in this image is this gentleman in the middle dressed as a clown with the silver face paint. And the way that a lot of these textures work on the walls they're standing against, this lush background, the way that a lot of the colors work. You see the patterns in the costume. But the figures on the side aren't distracting. They give it context. And so the woman with the afro on the left there, with her huge earrings and gold dress that's holding the red robe, it gives it context. You see that these are different characters of something that's about to begin with a production, perhaps. And then the couple on the right that are talking, and I love that woman's dress with the way that green works and the red and silver in her hair. And you get a lot going on here, but much like how paintings work, I think that's what creates this, because there's a lot of wonderful things going on with texture, just the way the shadows kind of creep in, and vignettes a little bit, especially on the bottom half of the image. Anyway, some absolutely wonderful stuff, and I could go on all day. Go check out the Pinterest board, and you can kind of click on some of the links here, and you can actually explore even more photos, because a lot of these are taken from websites that had more on them. And, you know, like I said, Pinterest is one of my favorites, just in terms of it gives you a way to bookmark images. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this, and that is essentially the work of Bruno Barbey. So there you have it, and we're going to continue on in this vein because we've done a lot of the photo lit episodes this year, and I think they're really important because I think that, you know, photography with so many people is such a thing where, you know, a lot of us are self-taught, and a lot of this great history of image making is largely ignored, and I think that it's really important to talk about some of these figures and talk about who some of these people were, people like Bruno Barbey, etc. And I tend to pick, I get a lot of questions from people who ask, well, how come you haven't done Irving Penn, or how come you haven't done whoever? And the reason is there's no reason in particular, I just haven't gotten to them yet. And lately we've been spending time on lesser known people because I'm a big fan of giving credit where credit is due if I can. And some of these guys, I just think that they have such an important body of work and are kind of overlooked in a lot of ways. And so I hope this is helping with that. We have a lot of new things coming up on the show in the next couple weeks. And unfortunately, I'm on a gag order on a few of them and I can't talk about them just yet. They're definite. So in the next week and a half, be prepared because I'm going to give a really cool announcement of some stuff that's coming up on the show. One other thing I want to mention before we wrap this up real quick, and I talked about this on the show last week and I want to mention it again, but my very good friend Aaron Martin is trying to do a film and he has a Kickstarter project. He lives in Ohio and there is actually a dig going on where they're uncovering fossils of a mastodon, and he wants to do a film project on this, and he's looking for $2,000, which is very cheap to do a film on, and actually all that money is going to be spent making a film on film. He wants to actually shoot 16mm film to do this thing, and he's looking for some help on that. If you go to a link, I will put a link in the show notes below. You can see a video of Aaron talking about it. He's a really awesome guy. He's got a great project, and I really would like to see him get funded. He's only got 3 days left, and he's got a little ways to go. So if you guys are interested, and you can throw $5 or $10 his way to help him get this done, I think it would serve a great cause, and it might be fun to have him come talk about film on the show sometime, even though he does, you know, motion picture type film rather than stills. But anyway, Aaron's a great guy. If you go to theartofphotography.tv/mastodon, that will redirect you over to his Kickstarter project. So once again, that link is theartofphotography.tv/mastodon. And he does have some incentive stuff in there for the higher levels, actually for all levels of the Kickstarter project, including his lovely wife, who I assume is the one making these little stuffed mastodons that they will give out as well. So anyway, check it out, theartofphotography.tv/mastodon, and that will take you there. And until we meet again next week, be prepared. There's a lot of really cool stuff coming up, and it's driving me nuts because I can't talk about it just yet. But I promise you're going to like it. We've got some really big news for the show. So anyway, once again, guys, it's been another episode of The Art of Photography, and I'll see you guys next time. Later.